In late spring of 1889, an agricultural town in central Mississippi became the focus of sudden press interest when a man reportedly awoke inside a rural holding facility and spoke only in an unidentifiable tongue. The event was recorded by 2 local newspapers, but state records of the incident were later altered. No formal inquiry was made into the origin of the man or the reasons for his detainment. Internal documents from a nearby medical mission suggest the case was internally reassigned under emergency classification. The Mount Pharaoh Language and Literacy Mission was established in 1873 as a small academic project attached to a private college seminary. Located in the rural township of Belcote, Mississippi, it was formally registered as an educational facility but received state funding through agricultural development programs. Publicly, it described itself as a linguistic preservation site for endangered dialects brought to the region by displaced migrant workers. Its staff included several professors, a rotating clerical board, and 4 permanent residents. It held biannual public lectures and published a monthly bulletin. There were no reported complaints or audits on file until 1889. The Mount Pharaoh Language and Literacy Mission occupied a 2-story wood frame building at the edge of Belcote's original farming district. By 1889, its outer walls showed signs of weather wear and minimal upkeep, but the interior remained in working condition. The structure was modestly furnished and relied on a shared water supply routed from the main well serving the town's schoolhouse. Its east-facing windows looked out toward the pastures and silos of the township's grain storage area. Behind the building, a compact shed stored unused press equipment and ink barrels from the discontinued publication arm. The second floor contained 5 rooms, 3 of which were designated for research materials and cataloging. According to enrollment archives held by the college in nearby Kilroy Parish, the mission had never hosted more than 9 students at a time. The student body was not composed of local residents. Instead, participants came through temporary language fellowships, often arranged through outside institutions. Many had backgrounds in transcription, phonetics, or missionary fieldwork. The mission required all incoming fellows to sign a confidentiality clause regarding their assignments, citing proprietary linguistic data. The director at the time was listed in public record as Elias Merrow, a former professor of dialect theory. He had no medical or psychological training, nor did the mission list any personnel with clinical credentials. Nevertheless, the mission had been granted limited custodial authority under a clause in the Kilroy Parish Education Charter, permitting it to house non-violent individuals of linguistic or communicative distinction for purposes of academic study. This clause had not drawn attention prior to 1889. The town of Belcote had few reasons to interact with the mission. Its location on the far side of the grain boundaries kept it isolated from daily commerce. Most residents referred to the building as the Archive or the Old Seminary Wing. Mail delivery was irregular and relied on cross-town drop-offs by general store employees. The mission received its supplies by pre-arranged wagon shipments from the seminary in Kilroy Parish. Receipts indicate that deliveries occurred only once every 4 weeks. According to municipal documents from the Belcote Town Register, the first formal record involving the man appeared on May 9, 1889. A handwritten note, catalogued under Intake Unusual, described a male subject brought to the mission's lower floor under the directive of temporary linguistic confinement. The note was unsigned. It included no name, address, or prior identification for the man. The intake sheet used non-standard formatting and did not match prior documentation in the mission's ledger. Instead of listing a dialect or linguistic category, the form simply recorded the word unverified. The original copy of this intake form was later removed from public access. A photocopy, retrieved during an archival review in 1971, shows a note in the margin, submitted by third party, no audit. This annotation was made in red pencil, a notation method typically reserved for external reviews. No information is available on who conducted the review or why it occurred more than 80 years after the fact. The intake date coincided with a formal inspection by the Belcote Town Registrar, who visited the mission that same week for unrelated census updates. According to the Registrar's Journal, which is preserved in the Belcote Municipal Archive, he observed a man of unknown age and origin seated in the lower office room. The journal does not list a name or physical description, but refers to seeming coherence in phonation and deliberate though unintelligible speech. The registrar also noted that the room had been cleared of all standard furnishings except for a single desk and a slate board. No chairs were present. The decision to house the man within the mission was not accompanied by any formal petition or judicial order. The Kilroy Parish Courthouse confirmed in a 1934 record sweep that no legal authorization had been issued for the man's placement, and no complaints were submitted regarding unlawful detention. The absence of paperwork drew no contemporary attention, largely due to the mission's non-clinical status and its ambiguous charter language. At the time, custodial oversight fell under an education clause, not a medical or legal one. Despite its isolation, the mission did produce regular internal bulletins. In May 1889, the publication included a section titled Field Notes, which contained a short paragraph referencing unexpected phonological convergence in an unnamed speaker. The entry described a subject producing syntactic chains of uncertain typology, consistent in rhythm but as yet unclassifiable. The bulletin used no identifying details and did not mention the subject's location. However, the issue was later cited in a 1915 symposium on undocumented speech structures held in Baton Rouge. Two of the mission's resident fellows at the time, whose names appear in financial rosters, were assigned to transcription duties during the month of May. Handwritten pages recovered from the mission's abandoned records facility contain repeated sequences of phonetic symbols not linked to any known language family. The writing includes timestamps and vocal markers consistent with formal linguistic analysis. One page contains a repeated reference to a rotational pattern of morphemes, suggesting that the speaker maintained internal consistency in his expressions. Despite this apparent consistency, no match was found with any of the dialects studied by the mission. Attempts to correlate the speech patterns with African, indigenous, or European roots yielded no confirmed results. Internal memos, preserved in fragile condition, show frustration among staff over the inability to classify the language. One note states, "No convergence, no migration reference, not Pidgin, not Creole, structure intact but unplaceable." These remarks indicate that the team had ruled out hybrid dialects and known variants. The man's presence inside the facility appears to have been continuous for at least 14 days. During this time, no external communication was recorded. The mission closed its public hours and cancelled its scheduled June lecture. An official explanation cited internal re-evaluation of cataloguing protocols. There were no media statements. The Kilroy Parish Seminary issued no comment. Local interest in the case surfaced only once, when the Belcote Gazette ran a brief item titled "The Mission's Visitor." The article, published on May 18th, included a vague description of a gentleman reportedly brought in from the far fields who communicated in a tongue not known to these parts. The Gazette, which rarely printed more than 2 pages, did not follow up on the story. Later efforts to locate the original printing plate for the article were unsuccessful. The transcription records from late May indicated a shift in the subject's vocal structure. While early recordings noted continuous, uninterrupted speech of indeterminate phonetic origin, the later pages suggest the introduction of deliberate segmentation. Annotations from the mission staff describe this change as intentional pacing, with one note stating repeated triadic cadence appearing at regular intervals. The term was not standard, but internal memos suggest the team interpreted it as a possible effort at communication through patterned repetition. Despite the effort to decode, no linguistic parallels were identified. The fellows employed a method of cross-checking consonant clusters against their limited database of oral dialects collected over the previous decade. The results produced no viable match. One of the fellows, a junior researcher listed as M. Croft, recorded in his private log, "We are not translating, we are tracking a sound." This comment, while not included in the formal mission bulletins, was later reproduced in a private letter held by a regional archival society in eastern Mississippi. The man himself, referred to only as the subject in internal notes, did not resist observation. His movement within the assigned room was described as minimal and systematic. He was seen facing the window during morning hours, turning toward the slate board in the afternoon. He made no effort to alter or erase the markings placed on the board by the staff. All interactions were conducted silently, except for the recorded speech sessions. No name was ever obtained, and no written language was observed. An architectural note from an 1890 renovation plan revealed that the lower office room had previously served as a storage space for obsolete lecture equipment. Its conversion into an observation area was undocumented prior to the man's appearance. No building permits were filed. The room measured approximately 9 feet by 14 feet and lacked direct access to the second floor. The door was internal, leading only to the main hall. One small window provided ventilation. The walls were not soundproofed, though no external complaints about noise were ever filed with the town register. The mission's senior coordinator, identified in funding rosters as H. Lembridge, submitted a single budget request on May 23rd for additional parchment, ink, and a replacement recording horn. The invoice was routed through the seminary's General Supplies Division, but was marked with an unusual priority seal, indicating expedited handling. This classification had previously only been used for emergency requests during catalog fires or material contamination. The seminary's compliance officer later testified in a 1906 hearing that no explanation had been attached to the order. A separate issue emerged during the same period involving the condition of the transcription equipment. Staff notes recorded several malfunctions in the mission's primary wax cylinder recorder. Entries from late May indicate repeated warping during playback and failure to preserve the full range of tones. One fellow remarked, "Reel deforms midway through session, high register collapse after fourth mark." These issues were attributed to heat exposure and lack of calibration. The equipment was never replaced. Instead, staff began using shorthand notations in the margins of their recordings to indicate shifts in pitch and rhythm not captured by the hardware. The man's behavior, as recorded in routine logs, remained consistent across the 2-week period. Mealtimes were delivered at regular intervals, though no entries described direct interaction or response. Waste removal and sanitation procedures were described only once, in a passing note indicating a bucket rotation cycle implemented by a night staffer. There is no indication that the man attempted to leave the room or interfere with the observation process. By May 27th, internal correspondence began to reflect uncertainty regarding the continuation of the assignment. A note written by Lembridge to the seminary's internal review board posed the question of classification. The text, preserved in the seminary's communication ledger, reads, "We are without framework. This is not a dialect. It does not mimic nor adapt. The output is static, and yet the structure suggests pre-existing rules." The board's reply, dated June 1st, authorized continuation under discretionary academic study, contingent on the maintenance of confidentiality. This decision coincided with an abrupt change in the tone of internal documents. Where earlier entries described curiosity and analysis, the June records adopt a more procedural format. Session logs become shorter. Transcriptions are reduced to minimal phonetic outlines. Several pages from the end of the month contain only time notations and check marks. It is unclear whether this shift reflected loss of interest, procedural fatigue, or a change in directive from higher oversight. External interest in the case remained limited, but a single letter from a traveling minister, dated June 2nd, indicates that word of the man's presence had spread to nearby parishes. The letter, addressed to a colleague in Albany, Mississippi, references a man said to speak no earthly tongue, and calls the matter a sign of great confusion or a test of hearing. The letter was filed with personal correspondence and was not made public until the minister's estate was catalogued in 1949. By the second week of June, the man's status within the mission ceased to appear in any written material. The final log entry, dated June 11th, records session postponed, subject nonverbal. There are no subsequent entries under the language study roster. Payroll records indicate that both transcription fellows were reassigned to regional dialect surveys in neighboring townships. No departure date was entered for the subject, nor was any transition plan described. The mission's internal ledger for July shows no allocations for room supplies, parchment, or ink. Staffing was reduced to the director and one administrative aide. The June bulletin contained no mention of ongoing studies and focused instead on archiving practices and shelf inventory. Public lectures did not resume until the fall semester. When they did, the topic was the migration of phonemic stress in Gulf Coast Creole registers. In August, the Belcote Gazette printed a second article referencing the mission. This piece, significantly shorter than the earlier one, appeared under the title "Mission House Returns to Routine." It cited an anonymous staff source who confirmed that previous interruptions to research schedule have been resolved. The article did not mention the man, his speech, or the purpose of his stay. By that time, no public record remained of his arrival or departure. In the following years, the mission continued its work on regional language mapping, but it never again referenced any unidentified speakers or anomalous phonetic events. When the building was officially decommissioned in 1913, a final inventory was conducted by the seminary's property board. Among the listed items was a locked cabinet labeled "Unclassified Study." Inside were 17 transcription rolls, several faded notebooks, and a set of annotated charts bearing no identification marks. The contents were moved to off-site storage in Kilroy Parish. The building itself was sold to a local grain cooperative and repurposed as a storage office. Renovations removed the internal observation room. The slate board was discarded. No physical traces of the original layout remained after 1915. Today, no signage or public markers indicate the building's former purpose. In the 2 decades following the 1889 intake at Mount Ferro, a series of administrative notices issued by the Kilroy Parish Seminary suggested irregularities in the handling of archival materials. These notices, filed sporadically between 1892 and 1911, each referenced inventory discrepancies, including missing ledger pages, mislabeled cylinders, and an entire set of catalogued dialect cards marked non-recoverable. While none of these anomalies mentioned the unnamed subject directly, the timing and locations of the losses paralleled the months following his documented presence. The seminary's internal communication board issued routine follow-ups, most of which emphasized clerical oversight and procedural misfiling. However, a minority of these communications used phrases such as suppressed notation and post-review removal. These terms were not standard and do not appear in other seminary contexts. The language suggests a level of selective retention beyond mere accident or disorganization. One such document, dated October 4, 1895, was found decades later in a supplemental box of weathered acetate sleeves. It bore the signature of H. Lembridge and read, "Lineage not recorded, source not local, phoneme field misfiled at request, observation remained incomplete by order." The intended recipient is unknown, and the letter contains no institutional letterhead or routing information. Marginalia on the reverse side suggests it was used later for tallying supply weights. This reuse indicates the note may not have been preserved with official intent. The seminary made no effort to publicize its missing records. The broader academic community remained unaware of the inconsistencies, as the Mount Ferro mission had ceased contributing to external journals by the turn of the century. Meanwhile, local institutions absorbed the mission's remaining resources. The building itself transitioned from academic facility to agricultural office space, with all internal furniture removed and floor plans altered to accommodate ledger shelving and grain tariff calculators. Despite these surface-level transformations, multiple references to the 1889 events continued to appear in unrelated records. A letter from a regional phonetics archivist, preserved in the Walthorn Linguistic Society's deposit books, noted in 1901 that oral samples from the Ferro group show irregular harmonic contrast not replicated elsewhere in county surveys. The archivist, A. Devlin, cited unnamed sources within the Kilroy Seminary who declined to provide clarification. This correspondence was not followed up. In 1907, A handwritten entry in the index ledger for Southern Gulf Coast phonologies included an anomalous chart labeled Unconfirmed Structure, Inland Series. The chart contained phoneme groupings not found in any associated dialect families. Some of the symbol markers resembled those from the mission's May 1889 transcription pages. However, the index card bore no date of creation and lacked a preparer's signature. Cross-reference logs were left blank. While it remains unclear how these symbols reappeared in seminary materials nearly 2 decades later, their preservation suggests they were not entirely discarded following the mission's repurposing. Oral historians who conducted regional reviews in the 1920s remarked upon the absence of data from the Belcote vicinity. One surveyor, H. Trant, remarked in his travel notes, "The township has no memory of the archive. Interviews conducted in grain offices yielded no reference to language work." This absence of local awareness was considered unusual, as most seminary-affiliated sites retained at least nominal community recognition. Trant's observations were supported by tax records from the period. Between 1890 and 1905, no municipal funds were allocated for educational purposes within the former mission's precinct. All charter mentions of the building ceased in town meeting minutes after the 1893 fiscal reclassification. Despite this, ownership remained nominally tied to the seminary until its official sale to the Grain Cooperative in 1913. During this interim period, access to the facility was technically restricted, though no enforcement records exist. In one instance, however, an incident log from the Belcote Constabulary included a brief note dated June 17, 1904. The log references unauthorized entry into archive annex and describes displacement of unregistered containers. The note is unsigned and lacks a case number. It was filed under routine property disturbance. A later annotation, possibly from a superior officer, reads, "No contents of interest. Facility unused since seminary days. Matter closed." This entry was omitted from the public incident rolls and appeared only in handwritten duplications stored in the constabulary's annex records. Interest in the Mount Ferro site did not re-emerge until 1910, when an administrator from the neighboring county requested sample lesson plans from defunct institutions for comparative review. The request, addressed to the seminary's former education liaison, was returned with a stamped note, "Records from Ferro unlisted. No curricular material remains." No explanation was provided for the absence of documentation. Meanwhile, changes within the seminary itself further obscured the origin of the man who had been housed at the mission. In 1911, the seminary merged its linguistic division with a broader department of historical anthropology. During the process, all files not bearing clear instructional value were designated as secondary and removed from the main catalogue. Several were boxed and labelled MISC Field. These boxes were stored in the sub-basement of the new library annex, where humidity damage and improper sealing rendered much of the contents illegible within a decade. Among the salvageable items from this relocation effort was a binder marked Belcote, Residual Transcription. Inside were 15 loose pages of phonetic notation written in at least 3 distinct hands. Some pages bore partial water damage, while others retained pencil annotations referencing timestamps and tonal inflections. A typed index sheet attached to the front of the binder contained one phrase, "No corresponding audio." The absence of cylinder recordings was explained in a later inventory note, which stated, "Ferro devices non-functional, no playback preserved, transcriptions made direct from live session." This method, though consistent with emergency protocol following equipment failure, meant that the recorded speech of the subject, if authentic, was never reproduced or externally verified. All remaining analysis depended entirely on the written materials, many of which lacked dates or contextual framing. The issue of authorship further complicated the matter. In the years following the closure of the Mount Ferro mission, no member of its final cohort publicly acknowledged involvement with the unidentified subject. Personnel lists from the seminary's staff directories show that both transcription fellows relocated out of state by 1892. Director Elias Merrow's name ceased appearing in seminary rosters after 1891, and no death or relocation records have been confirmed. The administrative aide, H. Lembridge, remained on campus until 1897, but filed no final report upon his departure. This disappearance of first-hand testimony created a gap in the record that later review boards struggled to address. When the Mississippi Historical Register conducted its initial round of institutional reviews in 1923, it noted the absence of closure documentation for the Ferro site. In its official report, the review board listed the mission as discontinued due to academic redundancy. No reference was made to the intake of May 1889, nor to any deviation from standard language documentation. A private inquiry initiated in 1936 by the Kilroy Seminary Alumni Council requested clarification on whether the Ferro site had ever functioned in a clinical or custodial capacity. The response, authored by the seminary's then Dean of Faculty, stated, "The facility was used solely for the preservation and instruction of language materials per the academic charter in effect at the time. No medical or custodial operations were authorized." The letter was marked final, and the council did not pursue the matter further, yet indications of unofficial reclassification persisted. A supply ledger from 1889, rediscovered during a records reorganization in 1955, listed a shipment designated for non-standard occupancy. The shipment included bedding, waste removal bins, and a water carrier not typically included in research inventories. It was addressed to the Mount Ferro facility and bore the initials EM, assumed to be Elias Merrow. This notation stood in contrast to standard orders for that period, which rarely included domestic provisions. The archived supply ledger mentioned only a single delivery designated for non-standard occupancy across the entire operational history of the Mount Ferro facility. Cross-referencing delivery codes from the same season showed that all other shipments used the term lecture materials or archival supplies. The May 1889 entry stood alone. The ledger page itself was found misfiled among financial documents for a seminary horticulture project and was only correctly reclassified decades later by a temporary staff member during a short-term cataloging initiative. Several annotations in the margins of that page appear to have been added in pencil at a later date. The initials CD and the words "held separate" were written near the bottom edge of the entry. These markings do not correspond to known staff, and no follow-up entries clarify the note's purpose. The surrounding pages show no similar notations. This suggested that either the term non-standard occupancy had a one-time procedural function, or it referred to an unrepeatable category of use that the seminary never adopted again. Attempts to locate any official amendment to the mission's purpose during the late 1880s were unsuccessful. The seminary's annual reports for those years contained only general references to rural outreach and language conservation. Meeting minutes from the Board of Trustees, which occasionally referenced affiliated missions, did not include any mention of Belcote. One meeting in late 1889 recorded a line item labeled Isolated Field Assessment, but no location was specified, and the report was unsigned. By the mid-20th century, the case was regarded by internal reviewers as a closed matter. The structure that once housed the mission had been fully absorbed by the grain cooperative, and none of the subsequent tenants retained documentation from the seminary era. Photographs taken during inspections in the 1950s showed office partitions and grain tracking tables installed over what had once been lecture flooring. No sign remained of the original room configurations or observation area. Despite this, a handful of displaced records from the seminary's library renovation in the 1960s rekindled interest among institutional archivists. A mislabeled box stored behind a masonry wall during the annex's basement expansion was found to contain several dozen unindexed note fragments. Some were incomplete, others smudged or written in faint pencil. Among them were 2 pages of phonetic symbols arranged in tight sequences, similar in structure to the 1889 mission transcripts. A side annotation included the phrase recon entry, though the meaning of this abbreviation remains uncertain. The archivist overseeing the rediscovery, B. Merleson, prepared a confidential memo for the Faculty Council. The memo described the recovered pages as structurally patterned, absent from standard catalogues, origin unattributed. Merlson stopped short of suggesting they belonged to the 1889 collection, but noted that the layout and symbol groupings bore resemblance to known Pharaoh mission pages. No further investigation was authorized. The contents were returned to boxed storage and labeled historical fragments unassigned. Years later, Merlson gave a private account of the event to a university oral history project. In the transcript, he recounted the irregular formatting of the recovered pages and remarked, "They were careful. It wasn't random ink work. Whoever wrote that was charting something consistent." He also stated that the seminary had likely seen the contents before and opted not to pursue them. This interpretation remains speculative, but it reflects the broader reluctance to revisit the Mount Pharaoh material. One complicating factor in tracing the full record was the dispersal of mission materials during the seminary's departmental mergers. In 1914, various subsets of language data were shipped to remote storage units affiliated with outside donors. A ledger in the trustee archive lists one such shipment marked for phonetic deferral site unknown. That box, item 128K, has never been located. The tracking system at the time did not use serial numbers, making recovery dependent on written receipt slips, many of which are missing. A few years later, in 1921, a visiting language specialist from Illinois State College made a brief reference to bell coat anomalies in a letter to a colleague. The note, included among personal correspondence, cited a rhythm structure untraceable to migration lines and asked whether similar samples had been encountered in northern surveys. The colleague responded that no such pattern had been seen and advised caution in attributing any systematic value to it. These letters were not made public until both estates were processed in the early 1980s. In parallel, internal memoranda within the Mississippi Department of Academic Record Keeping from 1928 to 1933 listed bell coat only once. That reference appeared in a checklist of defunct seminary sites and included the word incomplete under the archive status column. No further clarification was given. The checklist was not distributed beyond administrative channels. The absence of institutional memory extended even to those who had been contemporaneous with the events. Alumni bulletins from the Kilroy Parish Seminary made no mention of Mount Pharaoh's closure or any related studies. When the seminary celebrated its centennial in 1948, its official retrospective omitted all satellite missions except those absorbed into current academic programming. The Pharaoh site, having produced no lasting publications or curriculum, was not included. An independent historical society in Mississippi attempted a retrospective analysis in 1975. Its report, titled Forgotten Academic Satellites of the Delta, briefly referenced Mount Pharaoh in an appendix. The entry noted unclear institutional focus, unverified custodial claim, and untraceable subject of observation. The report did not cite any primary source and relied on second-hand interviews, many of which contradicted each other or lacked time-specific details. Despite its inconclusive nature, the report marked the first public document to reference the case since the original intake records were altered. In 1983, during a routine evaluation of the seminary's compliance with federal archival standards, a review team flagged Mount Pharaoh as lacking closure documentation. The review noted that the intake form from May 1889, already photocopied decades earlier, appeared to be the only remaining trace of formal entry for the subject. No matching exit notation, observational summary, or discharge authorization could be located. The review recommended declassification of the file, but seminary officials maintained its restricted status, citing insufficient metadata. As the institution moved further into digital record keeping, analog materials from the 1800s were deprioritized. By 1991, most of the early language logs had been removed from the seminary's main access list. Remaining documents were transferred to a secondary location without digital reproduction. Current inventories reflect no accessible trace of the Bellcoat files in searchable databases. The material, while not formally destroyed, remains in unindexed storage. Interest in the case shifted briefly to the regional historical community in the early 2000s, when a graduate researcher studying undocumented linguistic events compiled a list of unexplained phonetic records from the Gulf region. The Mount Ferro incident was included as an appendix item. The summary described the 1889 subject as untraceable, unclassified, unverifiable, and suggested that any attempt to reconstruct his speech patterns would be speculative at best. The dissertation received limited circulation and was not cited in subsequent literature. With each passing decade, the institutional memory surrounding the Mount Ferro case grew more limited. As of the most recent inquiry, no former staff, faculty, or residents from the town of Belcote could confirm first-hand knowledge of the event. The building that once housed the mission remains in use by a logistics contractor and bears no plaque, marker, or registry listing. For all administrative purposes, it is an ordinary grain office built on old foundations. In the fall of 2007, an audit conducted by the Mississippi Historical Filing Reserve uncovered an overlooked entry in a transition log dated March 1913. The entry documented the final inventory transfer of Mount Ferro materials from the seminary's second library annex to the lower stack shelves of an agricultural studies building, temporarily used for surplus archival overflow. The audit team, engaged in reconciling century-old routing gaps, noted the label Classified Phoneme Structures, Unverified, and included a routing slip signed only with the initials JNF. The identity of the signatory remains undetermined, and the material was not included in the official digital accession list. Following this discovery, the audit team submitted a request to physically examine the agricultural building's storage annex, which remained intact beneath a now decommissioned grain testing lab. Inside a locked cabinet, sealed with a rusted latch and bearing an outdated facilities stamp, they located several wooden crates containing bundled papers tied with disintegrating twine. The condition of the contents varied, with several documents fused together by moisture damage. However, one bundle marked Recon C89 retained legible text and diagrams, including annotated phonetic trees and a series of pitch range comparisons drawn in thick pencil. The diagrams showed sound formations not previously encountered in the seminary's standard instructional guides. Marginal notes pointed out their sustained tone frequencies and absence of regional stress markers. One sequence included notations suggesting deliberate segmentation at mathematically regular intervals. No accompanying translation efforts or speculative reconstructions were found. A small card attached to the front of the packet carried the words "incomplete by instruction," followed by the number 14 circled twice. The meaning of the number remains unclear. The audit team's report to the Historical Filing Reserve included images of selected documents, and the findings were catalogued under a temporary identifier for review by qualified linguistic consultants. One such consultant, a former faculty member at a university in northern Louisiana, identified a resemblance between the tonal distribution on the diagrams and pre-modern numeric chanting systems used in rudimentary agricultural tally records. However, the cadence patterns deviated significantly from known formats, and no alignment with regional oral traditions was confirmed. In a statement included in the audit report, the consultant wrote, "Patterned but directionless, repetitive yet unfixed. It is as if something is trying to maintain order without knowing the system it belongs to." Shortly after the report was filed, the Historical Reserve was notified that the documents had been reclassified under an internal preservation directive and removed from external circulation. The stated reason was lack of provenance. However, multiple staff involved in the recovery expressed concern that the materials had been prematurely withdrawn without appropriate peer review. No appeal process was initiated. The case remained dormant until 2015, when a visiting research technician assisting in digitizing agricultural grant records located a mislabeled file box containing a duplicate set of pages from the 1889 Ferro mission phonetic logs. The technician, unaware of the context, flagged the pages due to their deviation from the standard grant language files. Upon inspection, it was determined that the duplication was likely made during a seminary cross-department consolidation in the 1940s, when various language files were dispersed for microfilming. These copies, having never been processed or entered into official circulation, survived unaltered in an untouched filing drawer beneath several decades of shipping logs. Unlike earlier recovered pages, these included session numbers and rotational tracking labels. One sheet marked Session 6 contained a symbol chain with a recurring pivot marker, annotated by a hand unfamiliar from other pages. The page bore a single side note reading "Loop unclosed, no shift after return." This comment implied that the sound sequence had completed its internal pattern but failed to advance, possibly indicating a structural stasis or looped cycle without linguistic progression. Analysis of these new materials was limited by institutional restrictions. The technician who found the files did not have clearance to handle them further, and after brief examination, the documents were transferred to a containment folder and logged for review by the seminary's archival gatekeeping unit. The folder was subsequently coded under restricted reference with no digital access permitted. During the same year, a regional symposium on decontextualized oral traditions in the American South included an anonymized case study featuring partial extracts from a previously unclassified phonetic document. The case study presented only the pitch maps and stress cluster tables, omitting full symbol sequences or speaker notes. The audience discussion yielded no consensus on origin, with one attending scholar suggesting it resembled failed mnemonic scaffolding, and another proposing it could be the product of uncontrolled glossolalia transcription attempts. No definitive conclusion was reached, and the presenter declined to name the source institution. That presentation marked the last time any Pharaoh-related phonetic sample was displayed in an academic context. When contacted months later for clarification, the symposium's organizer stated that the contributing researcher had withdrawn from follow-up discussions and provided no additional documentation. The matter was not pursued further. Parallel to these developments, one retired seminary librarian, L. Merith, began reviewing handwritten catalogue indexes from the pre-1910 period. Her interest had been piqued by inconsistencies in the internal cross-referencing practices used in language collections stored prior to the seminary's archival reorganization. In a narrow subset of indexes, she identified an anomaly. Several log entries used a formatting style that was inconsistent with the cataloging protocols used at the time. The ink color, spacing, and cross-tab identifiers did not match any of the 1880s standard records. Among the entries was one labeled PHC6LNK, with no corresponding shelf or cylinder number. The title was simply Rotational Class, unread. The date listed was May 17, 1889. It was the only entry of its kind, and none of the standard linguistic logs contained a similar code. Merith, who had once supervised the retrieval of phonetic rotors used in the seminary's now defunct mechanical playback systems, noted that the PHC6 prefix would not have been used unless the sample had been registered with intent for sound-based review. Her private notes, which were later donated to the Mississippi Academic Archives Project, speculate that PHC6LNK might have been a label assigned to an early, isolated attempt to mechanically interpret the unnamed subject's speech through stress class partitioning. However, the lack of follow-up logs or hardware receipts indicated that no successful playback was ever produced. Whether the rotor existed physically or was only ever theorized remains unknown. This entry marked one of the last tangible links between the 1889 incident and any structured academic endeavor to record or interpret its content. In the decades that followed, the mounting number of fragmentary documents, partial indexes, and undocumented transfers gradually transformed the event into an abstracted occurrence with no verified point of origin. The subject himself remained unlisted, unnamed, and unverified in every official institutional document. No census, intake chart, or post-custody log referenced his identity. Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. In early 2016, the Mississippi Academic Archives Project received a batch of miscellaneous documents from the estate of former seminary affiliate R. Lowen, who had served as a language record technician between 1942 and 1954. Among these was a folded memorandum that appeared unrelated to Lowen's documented assignments. The paper, visibly creased and discolored, bore a brief typed statement. Session 9 delayed. Subject no longer provides intake sequence. Verbal output ceased. Record withdrawn. Below this line, the document contained two numbers, 91-6A and 91-6B, formatted as if intended for file indexing. Attempts to identify a session registry using those numbers were unsuccessful. The seminary's central filing codes did not use the 91 prefix during the 1940s or 1880s. A cross-check of adjacent formats yielded no correlation. Archivists involved in processing the estate suggested that the code may have belonged to an unfiled or alternate labeling system used in temporary holdings. No matching document set has since been located. The memo's phrasing, particularly the term verbal output ceased, aligned with wording found in an earlier phonetic field memo recovered in 1983, though the authorship could not be confirmed. If the two were related, it would suggest that at least one record from the 1889 observation period had remained in circulation long after the facility's closure. The absence of audio components and the consistent failure to trace playback equipment continued to limit further analysis. In a parallel initiative, a graduate thesis completed in 2017 by a student at a Midwestern Archival Studies program examined patterns of language facility suppression in late 19th century academic institutions. One chapter included a reference to Mount Ferro, categorizing it as an unresolved linguistic intake site of unknown procedural termination. The citation was based entirely on institutional metadata, as the student had no direct access to the underlying documents. Even so, the inclusion prompted renewed questions among researchers familiar with the 2007 and 2015 rediscoveries. The seminary, contacted by the program's faculty for additional information, responded with a standard notice indicating that the Mount Ferro case remained under review and that documents tied to that site were being preserved for internal reassessment. The phrasing, while procedural, confirmed that at least some material was still being actively managed rather than discarded or lost. However, no timeline was provided for the reassessment and no public catalogue updates followed. In late 2018, a retired administrative clerk, T. Mears, submitted an informal statement to the Historical Filing Reserve indicating she had witnessed the relocation of unidentified storage items from the seminary's northern file wing during a remodeling effort in 1974. According to Mears, several unboxed ledgers marked only with thin twine and paper tags had been rerouted to short-term storage in a non-indexed corridor known as the Overflow Cove. The contents were listed on a handwritten slip as non-instructional voice log sheets. Mears recalled one tag reading, "Bellcote Retired, Session Group." No documentation from the remodeling team confirms or disputes her account. The Overflow Cove, used intermittently for surplus placement until 1980, was emptied during a departmental consolidation project. The records from that operation include no detailed inventory, and no transfer manifests identify the materials as having been reassigned. If Mears's memory is accurate, the Bellcote items were either discarded or absorbed into bulk archival lots without specific classification. A limited number of items suspected to have originated from the Ferro mission were later digitized by external grant funding between 2019 and 2021. These included 2 note pages containing phonetic symbol trees and a strip of parchment with tonal markers sketched in column format. The digital reproductions were assigned generic identifiers due to lack of provenance. No identifying marks beyond a partial date fragment, May 1st followed by a smudged numeral, were visible. A 2022 private peer review arranged by the archival grant team evaluated the newly digitized pages. One reviewer noted the consistent absence of retroflex consonant pairs, suggesting a phonological isolation not typical of known regional speech systems. Another commented on the irregular pause intervals, noting that breath spacing lacks syntactic correlation, implying the sounds may not have adhered to recognizable linguistic passing. The review did not attempt interpretation and ended with the conclusion that the materials should be preserved for non-standard linguistic reference only. Throughout these rediscoveries, no official party has proposed reclassifying the Mount Ferro intake as a confirmed linguistic event. The Mississippi Department of Educational Oversight, when asked to provide a statement regarding the documentation irregularities, maintained that no procedural fault could be established in the absence of a complete intake chain. Their final word on the subject appeared in a 2023 summary bulletin, which categorized the incident as unresolved historical academic misfile. Within Belcote itself, few references to the mission's former presence remain. Interviews conducted in 2020 by an independent historical media initiative recorded residents stating they had heard rumors of an old grammar school for professors, but could not identify where it had been located. One local clerk recalled that the building now used by a regional seed supplier had once been referred to as the Quiet Office, but no further context was offered. Even with these partial recoveries, no one has been able to trace the original session structures in full. Each rediscovered document references incomplete series, unlinked intake files, or disbanded observational notes. Where Session 6 and Session 9 appeared in fragments, no corresponding records for Sessions 1 through 5 or 7 through 8 have been confirmed. This irregularity reinforces the likelihood that the documentation process was halted before the project reached any formal closure or classification. The absence of institutional closure procedures has been raised in at least 3 internal oversight memos since 2009. Each memo recommended a structured review of the Ferro file group, and each was marked closed due to incomplete source context. No committee or review body has reconvened since. In 2024, a public records inquiry submitted by an independent archival volunteer revealed that several state repositories continued to classify certain mission-related files under restricted access, citing preservation priority and internal verification delay. Among the file codes listed in the response were multiple entries beginning with the sequence BCT 1889. No descriptions were included, but their sequential numbering implied a filing group of at least 12 individual folders. These had not appeared in any previous digital registry or review summary. The responsible storage facility did not offer further details. This finding was included in a quarterly newsletter circulated among historical cataloging communities, prompting renewed attention from researchers who had previously examined the Mount Ferro case. One volunteer archivist based in Louisiana submitted a Freedom of Information request for clarification of the BCT 1889 identifiers. The request was denied on the grounds that the contents had been designated for institutional verification prior to external release. The formal reply listed the status of the items as pre-confirmation unresolved. No definition of the classification was provided. Shortly thereafter, the volunteer archivist received an unrelated parcel of loose documents from an anonymous sender using a return address associated with a discontinued university. Mail drop. The documents, unbound and unnumbered, consisted of 5 typed pages and 2 faded carbon sheets. 3 of the typed pages matched excerpts from previously known Ferro transcription sets. However, the remaining 4 pages introduced notations and comment tags that had not been encountered in any earlier public release. One comment read, "Transitional markers failed. Voice loops to non-adapting stasis." Another, placed beside a series of narrow phoneme trees, included the phrase "entry complete, structure absent." These notes did not conform to the academic shorthand used in standard linguistic documents from the seminary or its satellite institutions. Their phrasing suggested procedural language rather than phonetic analysis. No authorship attribution appeared on the pages. The carbon sheets, while largely illegible, retained faint imprints of figures resembling session number tracking. One bore the characters 7C1, while the other displayed int exit unknown. Given the degradation of the sheets, no further interpretation was possible. The recipient submitted digital scans of the materials to a shared database used by independent linguistic researchers. Within weeks, the files were flagged by a review team that had previously handled anomalous entries from seminary collections. The team marked the new documents as non-catalogued derivative, indicating uncertain origin but consistent formatting with earlier Pharaoh-associated fragments. This raised the possibility that additional untracked copies or parallel documentation sets existed beyond the acknowledged seminary archive. While there is no evidence that such materials were distributed widely, the emergence of partial copies in both university-affiliated and informal archival settings indicated that duplication of sensitive records may have occurred earlier than assumed. If such duplicates were made before the mission's official closure in 1913, they likely originated during the final years of departmental transition, when oversight structures were weakest. Concurrently, a retired grant administrator who had worked on early Federal Archive consolidation projects submitted a letter to a regional journal noting her memory of reviewing unidentified linguistic papers stored in an unindexed drawer at a seminary partner library in the early 1970s. The letter included a description of pages containing coiling stress arcs and sequence lines without entry or exit notation. Although the letter was not accompanied by photographs or citations, the terminology aligned with language used in Pharaoh analysis records. She claimed the drawer had been part of a rolling cart unit labeled Series Not for Loan, and that she had been told the documents were on hold for internal confirmation. Her letter did not name the staff responsible for the hold, nor could any institution confirm the cart's existence. However, other documents from the same building include references to preliminary phoneme set storage not cleared. The parallel language strengthened the possibility that these were remnants of the Pharaoh file group awaiting final routing decisions that never occurred. Several of these secondary sources point to a pattern of discontinuity between observation and disposition. No consistent authority appears to have supervised the full life cycle of the intake case. Observational records, session fragments, procedural notes, and phonetic diagrams were filed by separate handlers, many of whom left no traceable record. Attempts to construct a continuous timeline of documentation have failed due to the absence of linking documents or date chains. In addition, no known witness statements or contemporaneous testimonials confirm the subject's presence beyond internal staff logs. Every surviving reference to his behavior, language, or routines comes from unsigned transcription entries or side remarks in mission reports. No personal letters from staff, no public statements from townspeople, and no first-hand accounts exist outside the institutional documentation stream. Even these materials remain incomplete, scattered across non-contiguous record groups with variable dates and formats. This lack of individual-level testimony has rendered the case uniquely difficult to evaluate. The subject, though extensively referenced in the phonetic structure materials, remains depersonalized and anonymized throughout the records. He is never given a name, physical description, or behavioral profile. Where some academic intake records include sketches, clothing descriptions, or handwriting samples, the Pharaoh file group omits every trace of personhood. It contains only structured data fragments, devoid of context or biographical anchoring. What remains is a series of entries, diagrams, and analytical attempts made under conditions of declining institutional clarity. As the mission approached closure, record quality deteriorated. Filing conventions varied. Session sheets were misnumbered, omitted, or split across pages. No final assessment exists. No determination of language group, origin, or procedural resolution was ever recorded. Even the storage location of the final documents remains unknown in multiple cases. In interviews conducted with descendants of former seminary staff, none reported knowledge of the mission's observational history. Most were unaware that the facility had housed a linguistic subject. A few recalled references to the phoneme case or the annex records, but these mentions were brief and attributed to passing remarks made during late-career document handoffs. One respondent said their relative had called the records the incomplete sound pages, but could not explain what that phrase meant. The town of Belcote holds no physical trace of the original mission. Its property records list the building as a grain depot by 1914 and a transfer station by 1922. Local directories show no intervening use. No blueprints remain of the interior modifications made during the observation period. Without those, the exact structure of the intake room cannot be confirmed. Recollections from the 1950s indicate that the back wing of the building, now removed, had once been sealed off without apparent access from the main floor. Whether this was the room described in mission logs is unknown. By 2025, the Mount Ferro case existed within a category of institutional record-keeping, where resolution was no longer a priority but a formality deferred. Its file code appeared intermittently in internal correspondence, most often as a legacy reference, appended to broader inquiries about unreconciled historical entries. The seminary no longer maintained active reviews of the documents, and digitization efforts bypassed the case due to its fragmented nature and undefined archival status. It remained listed in index sheets as a restricted, non-priority collection. The last publicly acknowledged item connected to the case was a compact archival index card retrieved during a shelving audit in the state's secondary preservation vault. The card, yellowed and brittle, contained only 3 fields: intake site, Ferro, date received, May 1889, and disposition status, pending. The word pending had been overwritten in pencil, likely during a later review, with a single diagonal line. No date accompanied the edit. The handwriting did not match any logged archivist from that period. Questions surrounding the case's unresolved status drew periodic attention from archival transparency initiatives, but no formal responses were provided beyond procedural statements. These included boilerplate language on restricted historical record groups under metadata review. No named custodian was identified for the Ferro file group. Most internal documentation referenced it only in aggregate with other unverified or incomplete observational entries. Privately, a few archival technicians speculated that the case was retained not for future investigation, but to maintain continuity within the archival catalogue. Its removal would create inconsistencies in the intake and routing ledgers from 1889, some of which remain publicly accessible. As long as those records were available, the absence of a termination code for the intake entry would remain visible. To avoid this, the entry had been allowed to persist in a non-active state, thereby preserving formal completeness without acknowledging procedural abandonment. Other institutions that inherited portions of seminary archival stock adopted similar practices. Our 2022 audit of the University Storage Annex in Meridian uncovered a storage binder labeled Non-Migratory Acoustic Data, Regional, Incomplete. The contents included clipped pages from the Ferro intake phase, but the folder's cover sheet listed only the broad category and no specific event. When contacted, the university stated the folder had been inherited with a bulk transfer of unrelated agricultural research papers and had not been reviewed. The folder was returned to storage. No formal institution has claimed responsibility for determining the original purpose of the intake. The seminary's charter allowed for temporary linguistic detainment under academic rationale, but the subject's lack of registration, unidentified origin, and unclassified speech rendered the justification tenuous. Since no translation was ever produced, and no meaningful interaction recorded, the intake could not be reclassified as educational activity under modern standards. Without documentation of consent or directive, no institution has labeled it a medical or custodial action either. One former archivist, speaking in a private capacity, described the case as outside institutional language. He noted that every review of the materials, regardless of era or protocol, resulted in the same outcome: partial data, inconsistent identifiers, no resolution. He described the records as engineered toward permanence without disclosure. This phrase, though informal, reflected the broader sentiment among those familiar with the case. It existed not to be solved, but to remain in a stable position within the archival structure, undefined yet unmoved. Physical storage of remaining Ferro materials has continued without incident. The cartons labeled BCT 1889 remain held in temperature-controlled vaults, sealed under administrative lock. Routine preservation protocols are applied, including periodic reboxing, humidity checks, and material stabilization. None of the contents have been re-examined in full since 2016. No public indexing has occurred. A memo from the State Record Bureau issued in 2023 instructed that the boxes be preserved indefinitely pending classification. This instruction mirrored language used since the 1970s, though each version came from a different supervisory body. The site where the events occurred now holds no reference to its prior use. Signage outside the logistics contractor facility uses contemporary branding, and no documentation on site refers to the building's earlier affiliation. Employees working in the interior office areas are unaware of the building's academic past. Interior modifications over time have removed all structural elements that may have connected to the original observation setup. The grain cooperative that once owned the structure has since dissolved. Inquiries into the Belcote Township's local archives yielded no photographs or maps from the period corresponding to the mission's operation. One plat map from 1888 lists the parcel as Educational Unit, Secondary. The term was used interchangeably across the state for non-primary institutions, including libraries and instructional sheds. No internal layout diagrams survive. The building underwent exterior modification in 1937, and a storm in 1951 destroyed the rear section. Whatever room configuration may have supported the intake process no longer exists. The lack of verifiable speech recordings from the subject remains one of the most cited deficiencies in the file group. Despite multiple transcription pages, tonal sketches, and rhythmic trees, no confirmed audio was produced. Notes referencing playback attempts consistently mention failed cylinder captures or loss of register detail. This absence has led several researchers to question whether the phonetic entries represent observed speech at all, or a form of perceived structure retroactively imposed by the observers. Without audio, no verification can be performed. Some suggest that the repetition and alignment notations reflect more of an attempt at modeling than direct transcription. The phrase rotational cadence model incomplete appears on 3 separate pages, but never in the same hand. Each time it is followed by a sketch of a phoneme arc ending in a closed loop. One page notes, "Return to same register without drift." Another reads, "No endpoint detected." These remarks point toward a pattern that resisted narrative closure. Whether the pattern was generated by the subject or interpreted from incomplete cues is unknown. Internal correspondence among seminary staff during the intake period contains minimal references to the subject's behavior. One undated message, attributed to administrative aide H. Lembridge, describes the output as neither responsive nor automatic, a characterization suggesting the speech fell outside known interaction types. The note also states, "Not imitative, not declamatory, fixed cadence without condition." These descriptions offer little detail but support the interpretation that the subject's speech, if that is what it was, did not correspond with typical models of learned or reflexive language. With no identified conclusion, discharge, or reclassification, the Faro intake remains on record as unresolved. The subject's name, origin, and purpose of placement are absent from all formal documentation. The final session records indicate silence, with entries noting verbal null and no further vocal data. After that, the entries stop. No staff statements accompany the end of the intake. No summary or justification is filed. The event disappears from routing sheets, and the name of the institution is dropped from active educational facility lists within 2 years. By the time preservation policies caught up with the fragmented files, the context necessary to interpret them had already been lost. What survives are scattered pages, partial diagrams, and annotations written in shorthand systems that were never formalized. The case remains, in administrative terms, stable but incomplete. No further inquiry is scheduled. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget. But we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.